Hi, everybody. I'm Neil Stevenson, Principal Architect at Hazelcast. I have some stickers and some T-shirts to give away at the end. Claire had suggested for the best questions. So here's a good question to ask at the end. What would I like to drink? Not lemonade. So, my journey with Hazelcast and open source. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? And might that mean a job for you? So we'll start with what open source means to me. For those that don't get it, for me, what first attracted me to open source was it's free. Because I'm Scottish. And we watch every penny in Scotland. But in fact, it's not really free, as we'll come back to. It's free in the sense maybe you don't pay any money, but you can pay in other ways. So, who am I? Let's start again. This really dates me. I've been working in software for 33 years. That's longer than some of you people in the room have been alive. This is not that particular one, but that was my first computer, I think called a ZX81. It had 1 kilobyte of RAM. It didn't have any disk storage. It just came with RAM. So RAM memory has kind of been in my DNA from the very beginning. But now I'm out on the internet. I'm going to be on YouTube as well. If you look for me on GitHub, you'll find me as Neil Stevenson. If you look for me in Stack Overflow, you'll find me as Neil Stevenson. If you Google Neil Stevenson, you'll find a science fiction author that is not me. I have not written a book. So, Hazelcast. Who's heard of Hazelcast? Great. Everybody in the room. So I work at Hazelcast. I get paid by Hazelcast. Hazelcast has won some awards. But since you don't know what it is, a very quick overview from my sponsor. So Hazelcast, a lot of people think of it as a cache. You can use it for that. That's a bit like saying you're using a chicken to lay eggs. Yes, it can do that, but it can do other things as well. Hazelcast, it's about stream processing, it's about data storage, it's about data compute. Typically, you have Hazelcast running across multiple processes, so it gives you that scalable storage, scalable compute. In the modern world, we've got events arriving from the left continuously. Things are always happening. People are clicking, people are moving mice on the screen, people are doing this, people are doing that. We've got events we need to process. There's a stream processor in there that will do processing. We've got data we need to store. If you ever look at stream processing, the important thing is marrying the data that you've got stored with the data that's coming in. So it does all these things. You can run it yourself, or we'll run it for you. If you click on the link, Viridian is our Hazelcast cloud offering. So it'll run in the cloud. You can run it yourself in the cloud, we'll run it in the cloud, whatever way works best for you. So on to the open source side. So Hazelcast itself, you can go to github.com/Hazelcast and find all the Hazelcast open source repositories. They're covered by an Apache 2 license, which means you can download them, do pretty much whatever you like. You don't have to tell us, you don't have to pay us. The only thing you can't really do is sell it yourself, because that's what we do. So it's an open core. The core of the software is free and open source. And then there's a couple of extra bits that we sell, because that's how we get paid. And this is kind of important from an open source perspective, because when people talk about open source contributors, which includes me, you can only contribute so much. You know, however many lines of code you do per week or per day or per month is not many. So there's certain things that software needs that's like quite a significant effort. things like design and thinking and developing very large features tends not to be done by community users just because of the time commitment. And that's why Hazelcast has staff. So we have people in the engineering department that write the big features. So when we speak to people, most are kind of comfortable with that kind of breakdown. It can't all be free because then these things might die out. But if most of it is free and that's what you need, that's great. And then there's a few extra bits that you might need if you're a very large organization. So back to the original question. What does it mean to me? This is it. You know, it's free, as in you maybe don't pay for it. It's often better than the paid for software. Certainly some of the software I've used, you had to pay for it, and it was rubbish. And it's like you could download something that was even better. And, you know, why wouldn't you? And maybe that comes back to the question from earlier. Why wouldn't you? But the part that gets more important is the community thing. We're not just taking, we're also giving. So that's a thing that I do. I download software. I contribute patches to some of it in my spare time. And those are tiny little things because I've got my spare time. And there's only so much of that. So really you can't just take. Please don't just take. Got to give something back. So, how did I get a job working for an open source company? Well, it all kind of started word of mouth. I was working for a consultancy firm, and I had a friend who got in touch and said, "Oh, dude, you got to check out this Spring framework. It's excellent. Never heard of it. Checked it out," because when you work for a consultancy, you need kind of a broad range of skills. You can't be kind of necessarily super in depth on one technology in case it kind of dies out. And then I kind of got involved with a thing called Gemfire, which at the time wasn't open source. So that meant when you're using it, you would basically go by the documentation. And, you know, going by the documentation is a bit kind of, we all want great documentation. It's just not a great fun thing to write. And you'd always distrust the documentation. You wonder, has it been kept up to date? Gemfire has now been open sourced, but that's a kind of different story. And then I got in touch with another pal. He said, "Dude, you got to check it." They all called me dude for no reason. You got to check out Hazelcast. It's even better. So I checked it out and I thought, yeah, this stuff's really pretty good. And then I went to a user group, like a networking night like tonight. And there was like one of the founders. And it's like, previously I'd worked for software from huge enterprises where there was no person kind of attached in your mind. And suddenly I got to meet people that have written software that I'm using. And that was kind of what maybe made it a bit real to me, this idea that you're meeting a person who's written software you're using that you'd never met before. And then it became, for me, a kind of a bit of an obsession about open source. I got in touch with Hazelcast. I mentioned Spring earlier. I got in touch with the people at Hazelcast because I knew them now. And I said, you know, your software is really good, but it doesn't have integration with Spring data. And I didn't get the answer I was expecting, which was, well, why don't you write it? And that became kind of the gauntlet. Somebody had actually started the project and kind of given up for whatever reason. I just kind of took it through to kind of conclusion. Now, I was doing this on the train. It's a bygone era. I was on the train 10 times a week, 5 days a week, morning and evening. And I would write a little bit of software most days. You know, you'd start out on a Monday morning, you'd be fresh. By Friday, you were asleep on the train. So maybe out of those 10 train trips, I would maybe do 7 and maybe only 30 minutes each. So you're talking maybe 3.5 hours of development. It took me a year. And this is kind of where people get obsessed about specific features and motivated enough to build it. So that was what I did. And the person I spoke to at Hazelcast was a person called Chris Engelbert. And then I was listening to a podcast that Josh Long, actually, and Chris was on it, and he said how he got involved with Hazelcast was a similar story. And then I mentioned it to some of the people in Hazelcast, and they were like, yeah, that was how I got involved. It was just that whole kind of becoming a part of it, kind of almost by osmosis. So that was kind of where things went with Hazelcast. One thing led to another, and ended up being offered a job, and took the job. And now I kind of do Hazelcast 9 to 5. And I contribute to open source software. So I contribute to Hazelcast. It's not my main job. This tends to be little things that I get madly obsessed about. To give you an example, like YAML files were processed with YAML, and I wanted them to be YML. So I wrote a patch for that for Hazelcast, and then I wrote a patch for it for Spring, which was actually just merged the other week. I'm looking at a thing currently called Zipkin, which is for storing distributed traces. And I want to see, can I integrate that with Hazelcast? And I'm looking at a thing called Gorilla, which is for Golang. I'm mainly a Java developer, and it's for storing sessions in a session store. So that's kind of the things that interest me, just little bits that I can do in enough of my time that I still have my 9 to 5 job and the rest of my life. So that's kind of open source for me, is little bits that I can do. And what you find is that open source tends to be very kind of community. We'll have, Slack channels, or you meet people who are working on the same software as you, and nobody's kind of, there's not tens of thousands of people necessarily, there's just a few people contributing. So how could you contribute? Well, really it's why. The why is so it survives. If you don't water a plant, it dies out. If we don't add new things to open source, even if it's like changing the dependency for log4j because the thing's wrong, then people will stop using that software. So you can't just take, you have to give back, because what you give back helps everybody, including yourself. Because if you're using software that people are contributing to, then it's kind of going to stick around for a while. And then you don't have to replace it with something else. So obviously you could contribute to Hazelcast. We have a thing on Hazelcast where we have Hazelcast heroes. These are people that have contributed features to Hazelcast. We have people that contribute bug fixes. And then we've got the Hazelcast engineering team that are writing code day in, day out for the Hazelcast code. But it doesn't have to be Hazelcast. Contribute to something. That's really the kind of story, because for me, it's enriching. It's like you can't just take, you've got to give, and you've got to give time rather than money. So in that sense, that's what I meant by it's not free. But the great thing about open source is you can go and look at the code. You can learn from seeing how another developer has developed something, which is another side of things that you don't necessarily always get. Certainly not from closed source. You don't know how it works. You've got to trust the documentation. So my kind of closing point really is, if you're interested in a job in open source, maybe contributing is an apprenticeship. You contribute software to open source. People get to see that you're interested in open source, that you're a decent developer. Everything's public in many ways. People can see you're on LinkedIn and know who you are. They see you on giving talks. They see you doing various things. They get to see who you are in advance. Hazelcast will occasionally be hiring, depending when you're viewing this. If you click on Hazelcast Company Careers, you'll find what positions we're currently hiring for. And then really the last thing, Finos. Where are we going with Finos? Because that's open source software, and it's quite an interesting point coming back to the earlier speaker, because that's being contributed to the community by large organizations. The very large organizations that are hesitant of IP will sometimes be contributing significant features to the community. So there's quite a few large projects that have been donated. So it's not always going to be the case that big organizations are kind of super wary. Perhaps we can turn that tide. There's all sorts of software you've seen that being used at a company, and it's not really to do with their core business. It's deployment scripts for Kubernetes or something. Everybody could benefit from that. So we're hopefully be at the Finos Forum in New York, possibly talking about some Hazelcast projects. I've always been a bit of a Spring person, and then I found out Rod Johnson, who wrote Spring, had something to do with Hazelcast as well. So currently I'm kind of looking at with a tool called Spring Bot, 1.0, not Spring Boot, looking at that to see, how can that play with Hazelcast, and then that gives something back to people. So questions for 5 t-shirts, 1 each. If you think of questions afterwards or you're watching on the web, you can just send me an email, neil@hazelcast.com. I'll try and respond, but who knows when that will be, just depends how busy I am and what kind of question it is. Any questions?
I was just going to say, I really like your comments about there being real people behind open source. Now,
Yeah.
it seems like a funny thing to say because there's real people behind every piece of software. But with open source, you can find the people. They're at conferences. There are quite often big open source projects have a name associated with them. You can find them on Twitter. I think it's I've not heard that said before.
That's people. It's their brainchild or whatever you want to call it. They kind of love. They created this, and then it takes on a life of its own. So they really get involved. But the ability, most of the open source projects I've seen, it's not like thousands of developers. You check it on GitHub, and there's like 50 contributors, or it's a small community for most of them, or for all the ones that kind of been using. I don't know if that's universally true, but certainly most of the ones I've seen are small. And even amongst the committers, you'll find there's like a core, there's like 5 or 6 people that are kind of doing it all the time. And maybe some of those are kind of employees or in some way commercially incentivized to do it. But at the end of the day, that software is still public. You can still use it for free.
As a kind of beginner developer, which I am, I guess I'll ask some advice on how to kind of approach it, because I'm still learning and I can't even start and contribute to open source. One of the things that you said in your talk, which was great, was that just by reading it, you can learn a lot. But like, kind of, if you were to give advice to somebody that's beginning out,
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 parts actually to my answer. One is certainly for Hazelcast, and I'm sure it's the same for others. There are issues, like bugs and things that are kind of beginner-friendly ones. Here's a beginner-friendly, the one I did, YAML and YAML with and without the A. And that gets you into how the code works, because you have to then look at it and write some code and write some tests, not that way around, write some tests, write some code. So that gets you in there in terms of coming up to speed with how it works internally. And what you also find is that a lot of places have Slack channels or Gitter or whatever, and you've got a way to interact with people and ask questions. And if you can ask questions in the right way, people are very helpful. Not how do I do this kind of question, but how does this feature really work, or what happens in these? So you don't just kind of come in with the basic question, I'm a newbie, don't understand how this works, and I'm not looked at the documentation. That doesn't get you very far. People are human. If you ask a stupid question, you're maybe not going to get the most helpful answer. But if you can ask a good question, people often fall over themselves to help you. I'm trying to do this, and it's like, I just can't get this to work. What scenario should I use this? sometimes people are just out the goodness of their hearts, helping people, getting people up, because it's, if your standard goes up, theirs doesn't come down. It's not, it's not a trade-off.
Curious to ask you something because of how many years of experience you have in open source, and I feel like you probably saw different trends across the years. So if you could, wave a magic wand, tell Genial which is there one thing you would change about open source and how it works?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's clarity on licensing, because you can go and download something. I'm not a lawyer, and it's like, I have to have a license to understand, and there's too many of them. There's like, you've got, Apache licenses, GNU licenses, what does it mean if this uses that, and how does all the dependency trees change from version to version? That's the thing that I've found. And perhaps this is why some organizations are kind of wary of open source, because they might indirectly breach licensing by bringing something in that brings in something else. So that's the thing that I think is for me, being the most confusing, is knowing what you could use where. But I don't know if that's unique to me or just for everybody. Yeah, question.
I have a question. Well, because you were talking about your journey about the open source, I think the process first say you just started to use the open source shared artists and to be a communicator. I don't know where to get motivation for you to want to keep all these things open. Because
it's just a...
They have the localization. They develop something, maybe they want to make it commercial.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not 100% sure how I'd answer that, but what I found when I was working in consulting, you go from company to company, and you'd see everybody just rebuilt the same thing. And, they needed something to do something, and they had to build it themselves because they didn't have budget to buy it and there wasn't any other alternative. And, back when I started, there wasn't internet. You couldn't just download things. You had to buy it, and it came in on a tape or whatever it came in on at the time. So I think perhaps in some sense, the internet opened that out and allowed people visibility of what other ways existed. And I just like the kind of idea that somebody else has solved this problem for me. I can download it. Now, it maybe won't be a perfect answer because somebody else's software has bugs in it as well. It does it just saves you productivity. All the boilerplate stuff, you can just download a solution for. So that was maybe what kind of excited me about it. And maybe I felt there was like an emotional contract there that if you're using it, you've got to, maybe I've said this a few times, I've got this feeling that you've got to give back. Okay, thank you.